How's it going? Doing another little Ukraine update video here. I'm standing here next to the scenic Choyas Creek. Very, very clean local stream here. So, recently, this morning, throughout yesterday, Russia had been firing many cruise missiles that have hit various civilian targets in Ukraine, as well as critical infrastructure targets. So this takes a form of a sort of a shock and awe campaign, where hits to basically critical power infrastructure, be it transformers, service stations, what have you, has knocked out actually a decent amount of the power for many Ukrainian cities. In Kiev, at least half the city was on blackout. I believe it was a similar situation in Lviv, Dnipropetrovsk, and Zaporizhia. So, as well as that, the missiles have been hitting, there's tons of videos of this, where one hit, for example, a civilian, or really almost like a tourist sort of pedestrian walkway that was a lookout over a very scenic view of the city of Kiev and the Dnieper River. So clearly not something that has any strategic significance at all. And there have been multiple missiles that have been hitting playgrounds. Some they've just hit in the middle of, very busy intersections. One in what's probably the main busiest intersection in the capital. Probably the most busy intersection in all of Ukraine. Had a missile that hit right in the middle of the intersection. Playgrounds, apartment blocks, you name it, have been getting hit. And what's interesting about this is these are really expensive missiles they're using, cruise missiles. There's different figures, different estimates of how much they cost, but they range from the millions on the high end to some people have said they can get them for $300,000. I have my doubts about that. If that's the case, then it's sustainable for them to be doing that when it comes to their military. But what's more likely is that they're in the millions, each one, in the high millions each one. Some even estimate that on the attacks in the last 2 days with missiles, the Russians have spent up to $700 million. So that's a hugely significant amount of money. If the high estimates are true, if the lower estimates are true, it's a little less significant, obviously. Excuse me. But the reality of the situation is such that these missile attacks, Putin has said, are in response to a terrorist attack that occurred on the Kerch Bridge. But again, the reality of the situation is the Kerch Bridge, which was struck by a bomb, and it's not exactly clear how. This Kerch Bridge is a legitimate military target considering it's being used for military transportation. And when two countries are at war with one another, and I know Russia considers it a special military operation, rather than an actual war, the reality is the two countries are at war. Ukraine considers it a war at bare minimum on their end. So they're well within their rights based upon international law and just honestly common sense, because when you're at war with someone, attacking their military transportation, that's part of their military. That's a totally legitimate target, and that's pretty universally agreed upon as a general premise. And even Russia agrees upon that premise that military transportation lines are valid targets, but still they call it a terrorist attack, and so they respond then by attacks on civilians. But you got to ask yourself, what is then the definition of terrorism? Well, the definition of terrorism, to paraphrase it a little bit, is essentially violence on civilians or usually on civilians. I don't know if it necessarily has to be on civilians, but it's violence done typically on civilians for a political goal. So, which of these two attacks then, the civilian attacks on playgrounds, apartment blocks, pedestrian walkways, intersections, what have you, or an attack on a vital bridge in the Russian logistics network for the occupied territories of Ukraine? Which one better fits the definition of terrorism? I'll leave that as an open question to you viewers, because I think we all know the answer to that one. So, how exactly now was the Kerch Bridge that attacked? Because previous to this, there had been no, HIMARS strikes on them at all. They're out of HIMARS range, the Kerch Bridge. So, how did this happen? So the Russians allege that there was some sort of sabotage attack that was basically planned by special forces or agents of Ukraine, and essentially that they planted a bomb in some truck, and, then they bombed the bridge. But there's a couple things that don't really add up. Is that, supposedly things get scanned when they enter this bridge. I mean, unless they're not doing that, which is a really big indication that their security is lax and they're not really running a modern or serious operation. But in all likelihood, they would scan things going across such a critical piece of infrastructure. So that's a red flag in the story right there, or at least a red flag in the Russian customs, or whoever it is who inspects goods going across that bridge, or just gives a scan for things like bombs. So the other issue is that when you look at videos of the explosion itself, and there's several angles of it, and I'll link one of them in the description, or at least one of them in the description. The blast doesn't really look like it's coming from this truck in question, and you can see the truck that they allege caused the blast, and it kind of just rolls along the road, and then there's a blast that looks like it comes up from the right side of the bridge under, and coming up over the bridge. So it really doesn't even look like it was coming from the truck. I'm not even sure what the narrative is on whether the truck driver lived or died, because if the explosion was coming from his truck and it did so much damage to the bridge, which the bridge was severely damaged, he wouldn't have survived, right? But I've also seen content coming from some of the the Russian Telegram channels and Russian media where they're talking about the guy being interviewed. So how is it you have a bomb inside your truck? You blow up an entire section of the bridge, and you live. I don't really see how that happens, how that adds up. It just doesn't seem right to me. So, in all honesty, there's a high probability that, given these red flags, that the Russians could have bombed their own bridge. It's possible. Obviously, that's not something we could confirm or deny, of course. We certainly couldn't confirm it. But there doesn't really seem to be any solid evidence that Ukrainians blew up the bridge. The official story of how it happens doesn't really fully add up, or how it happened doesn't add up. And there's no feasible way the Ukrainian military itself would have been able to do it. So I don't know, folks. It seems a little fishy to me, and there would be, of course, a motive to do so. And the motive, of course, would be a justification to launch these sort of attacks, which might, in and of itself, seem, well, who cares? They've been attacking civilians the whole time. Well, they've significantly raised up the heat in the last couple of days, in the last day and a half, really, to a tremendous degree. And this comes at a time where, you have elite units of the Russian military being called up to Moscow for not really any particularly known reason publicly, but what it shows is there's some concern for an internal issue that they need soldiers in Moscow because of some kind of threat brewing in the capital city against Putin's leadership. So what I think a motivation this would be, sorry about that. Excuse me. What I think a motivation of that would be is to placate a lot of the hardliners in the Russian government that basically wanted Putin to go way harder on the Ukrainians, wanted them to hit way more civilian targets. And another way in doing so, to placate those hardliners, will also making a sort of a justification to more of the soft line elements, right? And saying, well, we're doing this in response to this terrorist attack against us, right? So it's an interesting current situation. The Russian rhetoric is getting more and more threatening, when it, directly threatening nuclear war. And next week, in response, NATO's actually going to be doing nuclear weapons drills, practicing for a possible eventuality where the Russians do decide to use nuclear weapons, deciding what exactly we're going to do, what the protocol is, and trying to see, doing some stress tests at how we do under pressure and how our alliance is going to do under that situation. So, it's to be seen what the future holds, folks. Have a good one.